Welcome, everyone, to the 25th Annual Mary Ellen and Jim Miller Celebration of Writing. I'm Dr. Allison Lehman. I'm Department Head of English here at WKU. We're so pleased that you can be with us today in person. Last year we had to do this all virtually, so this is a nice return to almost sort of normal. If you are here with us virtually, we're really glad that you're able to join us as well. One of the things that is really special about this event is the opportunity to engage with the vibrant community of Kentucky writers. Today, I am honored to introduce essayist and poet Andy Wright, author of Paper Concert, A Conservation Around, and which was published this year by Sarabam Books, as well as 3 poetry books and 6 chapbooks. She has received 2 Peter Taylor Fellowships to the Kenyon Review Writers Workshop, an individual artist fellowship from the Tennessee Arts Commission, an individual artist fellowship from, I'm sorry, I'm breathing twice now. There's so many things, it's easy to get lost in them. And a fellowship to the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. Her essays and poems appear in journals such as Fourth Genre, Georgia Review, and Ninth Letter, among others. She's the coordinator of Austin Peay State University's creative writing program and edits Zone 3 Journal and Zone 3 Press. Ms. Wright led a workshop for our finalists this morning and will announce the 3 winners, followed by a reading of some of her work. Before we get started though, because he deeply loved Mary Ellen, I've asked Dr. Rob Hale, WKU's Vice Associate Provost of Faculty and Academic Elegance. This is one of those mornings, right? My goodness, and it's not even morning, it's afternoon. He will help us kick off today's event with a few words about Mary Ellen. Please welcome Rob Hale.
Thanks, Allison. I really appreciate being asked to participate in this event. This is one of my favorite events, and you're trying to make me cry already. I'm a notorious public weeper whenever she said how much I love Mary Ellen, because I dearly loved Mary Ellen. So for 21 years, Mary Ellen Miller organized the Jim Wayne Miller Celebration of Writing to honor the work of her renowned husband, author of many volumes, including Copperhead Cane, The Mountains Have Come Closer, and Briar, his book. Jim Wayne Miller has been called the great ambassador for Appalachian literature. For 21 years, Mary Ellen nurtured her husband's literary legacy, which culminated in the production of Every Leaf a Mirror, the Jim Wayne Miller Reader, co-edited with Morris Grubbs, and in Dr. Miller's posthumous induction into the Kentucky Writers Hall of Fame in 2015. Mary Ellen was a professor of English at WKU for over 53 years, the longest serving faculty member in WKU's history. She played a pivotal role in developing creative writing as a minor, major, and graduate emphasis within the English department. And in 2015, she became a founding member of WKU's MFA in creative writing faculty. In addition to her record-breaking decades of teaching and service to the university, Mary Ellen was an accomplished poet and editor. Her collection, The Poet's Wife Speaks, won the Old 70 Creek Press Prize in 2011. With Morris Allen Grubbs, she won the Weatherford Award for Every Leaf a Mirror, dubbed one of the best books on Appalachian culture for 2014. In 2017, President Gary Ransdell designated Mary Ellen as WKU's first and only University Poet Laureate. While Jim Wayne Miller's work and legacy continue to be a central part of the annual festivities, 3 years ago, for very obvious reasons, we rechristened this important event to honor both partners in this dynamic duo. So I'd like to welcome you to the 25th Annual Mary Ellen and Jim Wayne Miller Celebration of Writing. It's the Silver Anniversary Edition, y'all. 25 years. I'd like to acknowledge some folks who are out there in the World Wide Web and internet land. Ruth Miller, Mary Ellen's daughter, is watching from California. Fred, her son, and his wife, Lynn, and hopefully Marietta and James, the kids, are watching from up in Louisville. We wish you guys were here. We miss you. I'd also like to recognize, I guess, host emeritus of this event, David Lee, university historian. David aged out of this role a few years ago, and so, you know, I'll do it for a little while, but nobody can have the longevity of David Lee. For the past 24 events, the celebration has shined the spotlight on three things though, not the people I just mentioned. Student writers, the guest writer, and the workshop leader in writing itself. This year, we continue that tradition. But before we get to those main events, I hope you'll allow me to say just a few more words about Mary Ellen. At last year's Zoom event, I was intrigued thinking about how she might fathom this very old school event that's so enshrined in rituals and traditions being held on computer screens. I know she'd be pleased that we are edging towards normal, even though we're masked, and this is driving me crazy, and that we are this year in the Kentucky Museum, one of her favorite places on campus. She would be thrilled that we have wine. That was one of the most important things about this for, no, it wasn't. It was the fourth most important thing about this for her. She'd be overjoyed, even more overjoyed at the bright young talent. And I've had at least 3 of these guys in class, so I know how talented they are. Bright young talent before us. She wouldn't want to miss an opportunity to celebrate student writers, and she wouldn't want to miss an opportunity to showcase the fine work of Andy Wright. But alas, all of this celebrating and showcasing ain't free. So now comes my shameless pitch to ask you to help us pay not only for the wine and refreshments, but also for the prizes and for future workshop leaders by supporting the Mary Ellen and Jim Wayne Miller Celebration Fund. I feel like I should pass a hat at this point, but we won't be quite that crass. If you'll look on the back of your program, there's a bit there on the web page where you can go if you'd like to contribute to this, or you can also contact the development office, and they'd be happy to take your money. So now that crass part's over, again, I'd like to welcome you all here. This is just a fabulous turnout, especially as we transition back into this new normal. And I'll hand it over to our special guest, Dr. Andy Wright. This morning, as Allison mentioned, Dr. Wright led a workshop with our 10 student writers selected from a larger pool of contestants. These finalists are now a part of the history of creative writing at WKU. You're part of the history of creating creative writing at WKU. And you've joined the ranks of writers going back to the 90s. Professor Wright will now recognize the finalists and the prize winners. Dr. Wright.
Thank you so much, and thank you for coming. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for everybody who submitted to the contest. Thank you to Mary Ellen and Jim for inspiring this. And thank you to the winners who will soon be announced, but I'm going to wait and announce the finalists first. Samuel Chumley, who I got to work with in the workshop today, wrote "Pray for the Skunk." Can you all hear me okay? So I can lower it a little bit. Haley Eller wrote "Yu-Gi-Oh Cards and Sister Love." Lily Ford, who I got to meet in the workshop today also. Lilian Orientalis. Justin Harris wrote March 11th, 2020. Emra Mehmet, I practiced this name, sorry. Mehmetovich, Mother, sorry, Emra. Seth Nevin wrote A Liar's Guide to Fitting In. Lizzie Elizabeth Roth wrote My Own Religion. Sydney Sellums wrote Flick. Catherine Sheffield, Deciding on a Bluebird. Kayla Spears did My Nana Relearned Life at 60. And Adam Woodward wrote And Them. So thank you to all the finalists. We'd like to applaud and congratulate them. In the workshop today, where I got to meet with the finalists, we talked about contests and contest judging, and it's a very challenging position to be in. If you ever find yourself in something like that, you have to define standards and criteria by which you're judging. And no one tells you what those are going to be. They assume that you know that already. And so they just give you this big hat and they tell you, okay, decide who is the best of this bunch. And of course, the best of the bunch is kind of arbitrary. Not only is it dependent upon my personal decision, but it's also dependent on my personal decision in the wake of the pandemic and all of the other considerations that we're undergoing. And so in any given year, something is going to take precedence over something else. In one year, imagery and beauty of the sensory descriptions is going to take precedence. And another year is going to be the rich language that someone is using and the texture of the syntax, the voice that they use, that's going to be taking precedence. And then another time it might be the characterization. So what we talked about, the lens that I was using to judge this very specific contest, is thinking about how each writer took the personal individual perspective and used it to open a lens for the readers onto a broader predicament, situation, demographic, cultural, societal issue. And so that seems particularly relevant right now as we're undergoing the shared experience of the pandemic. And so I'm sure that that was coloring my judgment as I was looking at them. But as I did, and I looked through the ones that most sort of used that first person to reflect the social issues expressed in the piece, those were the ones that rose to the top. And so with that, I'd like to give special mention in particular. I'll start with the special mentions. So the special mention would go to Lily Ford for Lilium Orientalis. I found that particularly rich in language. The descriptions of that, as you might guess from the Latin title, really rich language. And the other second mention is Kayla Spears, and that was My Nana Relearned Life at 60. That was a special mention because, as you might imagine, relearning at 60 is going to be a very powerful and poignant emotional pull. I wasn't using that lens in particular, but I just wanted to comment that those essays were particularly strong and viewed through a different lens may well have taken precedence. And so for the second runner-up, or the third place, that would be Emra Mehmetovic, and that is Mother. Are you prepared to read from your piece? No? Yeah, okay, good. I would love that. Oh, wait, hold on.
This is Mother. When Miss Wilson looked into my 5-year-old face, she was met with a depthless void where my 2 front teeth should have been, and an equally depthless void where behind my bewildered eyes. My crayon hovered over the line that followed the word name. The green pigment felt itchy against my sweaty palm, and her voice reminded me of the hairs on the smooth skin of a peach. Soft, yet unsettled. She sighed. M-E-H. With a clumsy hand, I wrote down each letter as it tumbled from her mouth. The line was much too short, with 4 letters of my first name and the 10 letters of my last. I don't know how she expected me to memorize the spelling of a 10-letter word when she too had to trail her finger under each letter when reciting it to me. How much English do you actually know? It felt like my esophagus was stuffed full of convos. She blankly stared at me, waiting for a response. I blinked back at her. You only understood half of what I just said, huh? I nodded. She sighed again. Figures. I didn't understand what she meant by that word, but my molars gnashed together instinctively. I knew, in some way, she had just insulted me. Before she reached the phone, I relaxed my sore jaw and resorted to biting the inside of my cheek instead. Before the sharp edge of my tooth could split the slick tissue of my mouth, a woman named Miss Martinez put her head through the door and whispered my name. The sound of the R rolled off her tongue gently, and I followed her out. She was the only person at that school that has ever said my name correctly. Down the hallway and around the corner, she walked through a door labeled ESL. I pointed to a chair. The table wobbled as I took my seat in between a boy named Tahir and a girl named Maria. The triangular flags hanging from the ceiling were tacky and impossible not to look at. Some had stars, some had stripes, some had moons, and others had suns. My eyes naturally latched onto the one with the yellow triangle floating on a sea of blue. I started to count the stars as Mrs. Martinez organized her flashcards. 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, it's time to pay attention. 9. 9 stars. I tore my gaze from the flag and looked at the card she was holding up. A is for, little by little, my mother tongue withered.
We talked in workshop about how Emory used that first person perspective to reflect the larger and crucial loss of a mother tongue. and the impact of that. And so hopefully you could hear that. I didn't want to ruin it before by giving away the ending, but it was absolutely standing in for a much larger situation that a lot of us didn't know about had we not been in that experience. And so she was educating as well as sharing that experience. So I'm grateful to you for that. The second runner-up is Samuel Chumley, and his essay, Pray to the Skunk, is what we will hear from now.
Pray to the skunk. Buried a skunk Friday morning. It was easy to find lying on its belly in a field with vultures circling above. Circling it on the ground, not sure if it was dead yet. There, a red gash was swarming with flies. Step up carefully, flip it with the toe of my boot. Looking and leaning over to find what had killed it, a golf ball-sized hole hinting some predator had picked something tasty from the young skunk. I put on gloves, wrinkled my nose at the smell, and stole the vulture's meat. There's a great spot at the edge of the woods, a small alcove in the wood line between walnut trees and a meadow. There, I dug a small grave and asked the skunk its name. It was a mostly one-sided conversation. But as I dug, I wondered if the sound of leaves hitting the ground wasn't a voice. There, the odd sense of being watched. Bet on the squirrels for that though. Lowering the skunk into its grave, I split a ripe walnut from its green flesh and planted it inside the body. My fingers are still stained. I watch that stain every day. It's probably walnut. The stains have been there thousands of times, but it's the skunk. After pouring dirt back into the grave and planting wildflowers on top, I knelt in front of the grave, getting my knees wet in the dew. Without knowing why, I put my head on the ground and prayed. I haven't been religious in a decade. I prayed to the skunk, wishing it a painless death. It felt small and personal, not the wailing at a wall that I remembered. I invited the skunk spirit to intertwine with mine and find me in another life. Do I even believe in that? Since then, I visited the grave at least once a day. Now there's a small cairn behind it. I keep the skunk updated on its murder investigation. Oreo, a local dog, told me it's probably a falcon. And I pray. Education tells me I'm probably just free associating for a form of emotional release. But it's one thing to know something, but another to believe it. I do know the skunk is tough. Those whispers in the leaves described how we may chase spirits into the furthest corners, but we still need them. People have a need to believe in magic. Now I implore you, dear reader, wonder where you feel the strongest magic. When you hear the voice that tells you there is no such thing, ignore it. You need to create your own magic. We need to keep it alive. It keeps us warm in cold nights of reality. Remember this. When I went back again Sunday morning, there was a small, neat stack of walnuts at the foot of the grave. Pray to your skunk.
Perhaps you too needed to be reminded of the need to believe and keep magic alive, because I was particularly struck by that idea and the gesture through which he keeps magic alive, which is not your expected gesture in that moment. And finally, for the first place winner, I feel the need to say that I did receive these submissions without any names. They were completely anonymous, because I learned after I selected the first place winner, which had no name on the file, that I actually had this person as a student at through middle college at Austin B. So I'm telling you that Tom did make the extra effort to make it a completely anonymous judging contest, even though the odds of me having one of your students was relatively slim, although we have a number of students in common, we've learned. But so this is Catherine Sheffield and Deciding on a Blue Bird, and I will let her.
I don't have a physical copy, so I'll be reading from my phone. Deciding on a bluebird. As people, we should choose what we mourn. We get out of bed each morning and we are faced with a slew of decisions to make. What order to take our pills, which arm to lather first, which socks to put on which shoes, and other exhausting decisions that become part of our trivial routines. We decide what we will mourn that day and how we will mourn it. Some days are light. Maybe we only have to mourn the loss of an ideal life. So we choose to mourn by dragging ourselves through the day out of spite. Other days are weighted, unbearable even. There are too many items on the to mourn list to count, so we decide to skip the ordering of pills, washing of arms, and pairing of socks and shoes. We decide to stay in bed and count each item on the list and mourn in a silent refrain of movement. I pulled myself out of bed on autopilot. I was running late for a coffee date with an old friend, and a blended chai latte is how I chose to mourn for the day. After deciding on a thick sweater in preparation for the early October breeze that might walk past me throughout the day, I met my friend only 8 minutes behind schedule. I had prepared my responses to the greeting I assumed would come, saddled with reluctant signs that masked how exhausting the exchange always was. Instead, my friend surprised me, shocked my system with a reminder of why she was my friend. "Do you want to go to the woods and bury this dead bird with me?" she asked. She gestured to a plastic to-go box in her hand, which I assumed held the dead bird. I hesitated. I had already decided on the walk over to use my latte to mourn excessive homework for the day, but something in me whistled at the thought of her proposition. What could it take, an hour? Maybe 2. I could spare the time. The idea of walking in the woods seemed cleansing. I felt my mind yell, "Please, this is what we need." "You know what, why not? Yes, let's go." As we walked to her car, walking on our way to an impromptu funeral for a bird we decided to mourn was much more healing than any caffeine-sponsored conversation would have been. We drove to a local hiking trail and found a hanger in her trunk to use as a shovel. We walked through the trail, sweating in my inappropriate hiking gear, and both of us carefully stepping on rocks lined with wet leaves. I felt a drop of healing in my chest, maybe my soul. I chose to mourn a bird today. I chose to mourn for something for the sake of mourning, instead of out of a daily obligation to worry about my life. I mourn my life every day, and it's gotten me no closer to healing than flying got this bird to its destination. We found a tree with a dirt mound softened by the morning rain to bury the bird under. My friend dug a small hole with her hanger and gently unwrapped the bird from the napkins it was held within the plastic container. We said a few words for the bird we never saw fly, but it really wasn't about the bird. Our voices spoke gently in the forest, like mist sliding over the ground, dense with grief but weightless in responsibility. A bird's lifespan is short in the wild. So many birds will die in our lifespan, maybe mourning a few of them is therapeutic. To mourn one of these birds is to mourn the earth we cannot connect to. We are trapped in the construct of not feeling anything just for the sake of feeling. We have to feel sad because of something. Feel sad because you have no money, because your grandparents died on the same day, because you were abandoned by every man in your life. Why can't I feel sad for the bird today? Just for the sake of feeling sad about it. Because maybe it deserves my sadness. Or maybe I deserve to mourn something better than what I mourn every day.
To me, that one most spoke to what we learned about the pandemic, or one of the things that we've learned from the pandemic, which is the gravity and nature of grief. I think we all have a different relationship to it in relation to the largeness of the scope of this, just a global pandemic, and then just the death of a bird, and then that connection to nature really spoke to me. I'd like to invite all of the winners to come up here and collect their prize, and another round of applause. It truly was an honor to be chosen to read and select those. I really enjoyed it. So thank you all for sharing. And again, please know that I welcomed all of the submissions. They were all very great. I was also honored to read because Jim Wayne Miller, this poem in particular spoke to me. Coming from Southwest Virginia, you develop a sense of self that refines as you get older, and you appreciate more and more the influence of the landscape and the culture. And so as time has gone on, the mountains have become more important to me, the people where I grew up. And so this poem, Bird in the House, which I was glad is not the same one printed in the program, I just wanted to share his poem with you. Bird in the House. In a dogwood winter of grief, he always turned from fresh graves into another country. Subtraction of lives from the land, altered fields, changed weather, shortened seasons, made him no longer a face reflected in the cool springs of their eyes, a sudden stranger to himself. He turned always knowing their lives had bounded the country he had known, the rounds and routines of their days, little seasons, familiar weathers, certain as rosebuds, fall apples, or first frost. Their rooted lives, great trees, his summer shade, their stories on the porch at night, rain on the roof. Like lines in the palms of their hands, paths they made from house to barn to field, got lost in weeds and never came home. Fields and buildings turned their backs on one another. A hill eroded down to white limestone, flesh fallen from bones. He always turned away with a heart fluttering like a sparrow, beating its wings at a window inside the empty house. Beyond a baffling hard transparency, cedars, fenced fields, light, air, country he came from. Limestone in particular spoke to me. I grew up drinking, you could see the limestone in the water in Southwest Virginia. So this book I am so proud of. It is product of many years of interviews that I conducted for Zone 3, for Guernica Magazine, for Kenyon Review, and never quite imagined them all coming together in this conversation. But the conversation was one that had continued to be played in my head for years between conversations as I heard connections between them. I'm also a poet, so I have a metaphorical mind. And so I was making these connections between the pieces. And then one day I just put them literally into one document and I put them all in conversation and I started pulling out the pieces. And so the question that I began with was, how do these fit? How do they connect? And so then by metaphor, I found my solution. Outside the window by my writing desk grows a fringe tree. One day in late summer, I noticed a strand of spider web blowing from a high branch. Sunlight snagged the silk just right, so it glistened like a silver hair before vanishing into the distance. It was caught on something, but there was nothing for it to reach in that direction except the roof of my house, over 15 feet away. I stood to investigate and saw that the line connected to the eave over a chasm hundreds of times the length of a large spider. The silk was slack to accommodate the wind, but like Philippe Petit's tightrope between the twin towers, it spanned a space that was both terrifying and laughable. I imagine that the spider realized her folly after stringing that anchor line and gave up, exhausted, but I admired the ambition. A web that broad could have netted dragonflies from the Carboniferous period with their 3-foot wingspans. I wondered if the spider embodied some ancient memory of that era or just had a tremendous appetite. I returned to my desk to work. Later that morning, I looked again and saw her, red-bodied and bulbous, sitting at the center of a web she had strung beneath that vast center line that shone like an eye. She had managed it. She was mad. I went outside and photographed her triumph. I could not fathom the engineering. The distance between the tree and roof looked impossible to leap. Even if she had ballooned across the gulf, carried by wind, spinning midair, that thread would have to have borne her weight as she reinforced it. She could have made the pilgrimage on the ground and lifted the cable, but it would have stuck on a grass blade and torn. I puzzled over the logistics, then let it become a metaphor, an essayist in miniature. The spider had spun a line as tenuous as the one that starts the fabric of an idea. And so I don't know if you all have them here. I never noticed them in Virginia, but in Tennessee, and just outside my classroom the other day, I saw another one of these phenomenal orb weavers, and they string these enormously wide webs, and I still can't really fathom the engineering, but it did seem similar to me to stringing together these different writers, and I've got filmmakers, I've got poets, I've got musicians and painters and writers of all kinds, scientists, biologists, And I put them into conversations around themes like feminism, class, the climate crisis, and it managed, I managed to develop little connections between them that held them together. One of the questions that I asked again and again, and without realizing that I had asked it again and again, not planning to create this book, but it was just part of the conversation that lived in me, was when in your life have you felt the freest? And so I'd like to pose that question to you now to just contemplate for a minute if there was a moment in your life where you felt the freest, because I kept asking people. I asked so many people that I began to answer it myself in various ways. As we talked about in the workshop, you answer the question yourselves. This is when Ira Subrungarong, who's at Kenyon College as a professor, he's a writer, a poet, an essayist, and this is how he answered it. Man, this question has got me spinning. Right now, the still moments when my son leans against me as we do nothing. In those moments, nothing else matters. Nothing is as important. And I know it is fleeting. I know it won't last because he's getting older, but also because his capacity to sit still is waning by the day. So I like writing about it in poems and essays, a snapshot, a still shot. Here's one from an essay written in letters to Bodhi, titled Letters in the Early Light of Morning. But sometimes when I am awake and stay awake, I do not leave the bed. Sometimes I find you nestled against me, holding onto my arm. My torso becomes a cave you hide in, my chest a fire that chases away any chill. In those moments, I stay and wait the hours until you rise. I asked Philonise Slaughter, who is a Native American Cherokee librarian at Austin Peay for many years. She retired in 2017. I asked her, when in your life have you felt the freest? And she said, on horseback, in England, in California, in the Midwest. Anytime I was on the back of a horse, I felt free. I asked Michael Martone, and his answer was ultimately the one that begins the book, or begins the interview sections of the book. He says, when I was trapped on an island, Michael Martone is a writer of many books, I'd say over 20 at this point, fiction writer and an essayist. He taught for years at the University of Alabama. He's a professor emeritus now. The island was Seriphos, a Greek island said to be the home of Perseus. The strange rock formation on the ridges of the mountains was all that was left of his enemies frozen there when he aimed Medusa's head at them. It was late season, September, and the Meltemi was blowing from the north. I was staying in a house with no running water in the old town at the top of the mountain. Each morning I would look down at the harbor and watch the sailboats attempt to leave the port, but they could not round the point. They stalled, attempting to reach and tack into the wind. I realized suddenly that even if I had somewhere to be, there was no way I was going to get there. I had that same feeling more recently, when I totaled my car going 70, plowing into the bridge abutment. I lost control, oversteering, and time, as we know, slowed. That feeling of great calm came over me, a freedom derived from helplessness. The moment when I was most helpless, I felt most free. To control is to roll against, and that, I think, is a kind of self-generated prison. The secret is to roll with. And then one of my friends said, as he was reading the book, he kept waiting for someone to get the right answer because I kept asking that question again and again. And so he thinks that the right answer was given by David Huddle. And this is one of the last answers in the book. And David Huddle, who is he actually grew up in Ivanhoe, Virginia, which is a tiny town where my grandparents met. And he was the very first reading that I went to as a young girl. We had the town Chautauqua Literary Festival, and we had lots of events, and he read, and I saw him read, and that was the very first event. And so later on, of course, I reached out to him and interviewed him, but he taught for years at the University of Vermont. And he says, it's a relatively recent discovery of, say, the last 4 or 5 years. I photographed birds, and mostly the ones to come to my backyard in Burlington, Vermont. Mostly the usual suspects: chickadees, sparrows, juncos, blue jays, cardinals, woodpeckers, finches, crows, grackles. I sit in front of the French doors, look out on trees, plants, a fountain, and bird feeders, and if I wish, I can sit still and capture moments with my camera when the birds are just doing what they do. I don't try for those calendar photos when the birds seem to strike exactly the right pose. I'm more interested in their usual behavior with its odd antics and habits. I particularly enjoy photographing them when they're interacting with other birds, whether of their own kind or of a different species. I like to catch them fighting, but I also like to photograph pairs of them sticking together. The male cardinal sometimes will feed his mate a seed as, in my opinion, a courting gift. And I can't resist taking that picture whenever it's available. What does photographing birds have to do with being free? When I'm engaged in trying to take a picture of certain kinds of birds, I completely escape myself, or I am free of every thought and sensation except those having to do with focusing on that bird and snapping the shutter at the right moment. And in that focusing on what its next move might be, my consciousness becomes more that of a bird than of a human being. In the attempt to photograph these shy and wily creatures, I'm alert and focused in a way that I never am in any other aspect of my life. I don't even think of looking at my phone, my watch, or my computer. I automatically give up all of those usual concerns, which is to say that the self disappears or dissolves for long, beautiful swatches of time. For that fraction of my lifetime, I am granted the great privilege of disappearing into the cosmos. You already got the answer pretty right. But that wasn't the only question that I asked. I asked lots of others. One that I asked of Denty Moore, who's a professor at Ohio University, ended up getting a story about a gorilla that tried to spoon him. Have you ever communed with a specific animal? I asked. Denty W. Moore said, an elephant. I was a zookeeper during my college years. Elephants are the most amazing creatures. I think they have minds that are every bit as complex as ours and big, big souls. So I asked, you were a zookeeper? Will you share a story? And he says, when I was 20, at the height of my invisible male hormonal fog spraying potential, a female gorilla developed a pretty strong crush on me. Samantha would just go nuts anytime I came into the main building where she was housed, even if I entered through a doorway at the end of the other building. She would bang on the bars and dance around, jumping up to look for me. Eventually, the head zookeeper had to ban me from the private wing entirely because he was convinced that she wanted to pull me through the bars and, well, you know, spoon a little. I will share a story from my own childhood. My upbringing that I promised. No, why it doesn't seem to be. Well, I found it. So this is one of the reasons why I related to the poem that I opened with. Every spring throughout my girlhood, insects, known colloquial as news bees, emerged with the pollen and hovered nearby as if to tell you something. Wings buzzing like radios broadcast from another room. I tried to make out their messages as I strained to hear the muffled words of my parents talking in their bedroom after they kissed me goodnight. It was easy to imagine a hoverfly's presence companionable. They couldn't sting you any more than a ladybug who climbed gamely aboard an extended finger. Because my grandparents' farm was surrounded by Jefferson National Forest, I grew up in a landscape that dwarfed its inhabitants. We lived under skies whose bright planets I pictured in geometry class when we learned about parallel lines that never meet. When lightning bugs filled the trees on summer nights, they warmed the reaches of space, gilded the darkness, stars come down to close the distance between us and the next galaxy. The land was densely populated, just not by people. Deer roamed the woods and skies along with foxes, eagles, possums, coyotes, snakes, field mice, mourning doves, and the ghosts of Cherokee and Tutelo tribes who had been killed or driven from their homes by settlers whose whitewashed version of history I inherited. Had the news bees I thought friendly in fact been reporting, they would have implicated me in past and present crimes. But the only communication they hoped to share was that the patch of goldenrod or violets I plucked was their territory. As a child, I felt I belonged to the natural world. I was of it, among the mating calls of tree frogs, crickets and katydids that thickened the screens we opened on summer nights. Congresses of geese honked into alignment just as my younger brother and I shouted from the backyard to find each other. Bulls bellowed their dominion behind plank wooden fences while we fought over toys until periodical cicadas scattered shot into rounds that silenced all of us. Thunder cracked over the limestone bluffs, exposing geographical strata as textured as these sonic layers, which would have crashed into cacophony if not for the prolonged rest notes held by the mountains. Even as a child, I knew this score unfolded not in 4/4 time, but in 1 and 1.2 billion. I could hear only a minute fraction of the whole composition, but it encouraged me to keep listening. And I hope that you all are encouraged to keep listening too.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wright, for sharing those lovely insights from your book. I should point out too that if you would like to purchase your own copy, we have copies for sale over in the back room there. I want to just thank everyone for joining us today, and congratulations again to our fellows and our members. I'd like to also thank Andy Wright for leading the workshop and selecting winners. I know that is a daunting task indeed. I'd like to thank the creative writing faculty and students who helped organize the event, particularly Professor Trish Jaggers for designing and organizing the call for submissions, MFA graduate assistant Bob Hayes for creating the poster and program, and Dr. Tom Hunley for liaising with Eden. I'd also like to thank Dr. David Lenore, who organized the writing contest and workshop. And finally, I'd like to thank Mary Montenegro and Kimberly Nessler, our office associates, for all the logistical support that they provided and for keeping me from dropping too many balls. We hope that you will join us again next year. In the meantime, please enjoy some nibbles and drinks and conviviality on this lovely Halloween day. You can also pick up some English department swag. We have some stickers and bookmarks. And if you would like to support our new scholarship for racial equity, you can also purchase a t-shirt for $10. Thank you again for being here today. Right over there.
Books.
The books, I said the books.
Oh, you said the books.
Yeah, I'll say the books again though. Because it's worth it.
Yeah.